Hey, welcome to another episode of I Own a Business. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Vargo, and I have with me Corey Pinnegar, who is the founder of TEEM. That's TEEM. And it's a remote staffing company, many of you probably familiar with, that simplifies the process of hiring international talent. So, welcome, Corey.
Steve, thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Um, Corey, remote workers, virtual assistants, not an entirely new concept, but I think it's something it hasn't really been embraced by ODs until somewhat recently. I think if we go back maybe pre-COVID, the idea of hiring someone internationally or allowing an employee to work from home, that wasn't really a thing, but that's changing. And I think partly, maybe largely due to we're hearing about fewer qualified candidates, rising payroll, things like that, that are really forcing doctors to think outside the box. So, for those interested in this model, they haven't really made that leap yet, but they're interested in the model, but they're lacking experience and maybe even confidence with managing remote staff, which, by the way, ready or not, that is likely to be a big part of the workforce of the future. We're going to talk today about how to build trust and maintain strong relationships with people who are not in your office, people that you're not directly overseeing every day. So, with that being said, Corey, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background? What inspired you to start a company providing virtual assistants for not just optometry practices, but I think you work in other industries as well?
Yeah. Um, well, it wasn't, I didn't have an Einstein moment where I woke up one morning and thought I wanted to get into private practice healthcare staffing. I wish I did, but that unfortunately would be a lie. I got into this because I was a very early employee at Weave, and that was purely by chance. I was going to BYU. I had just returned from my LDS mission in Australia, and my aunt was living in Lehigh. And she called me one day and she's like, "Hey, we've got this closet at Weave and we need, this is in 2016, 2015. We need someone to come clean it out. We'll pay you a couple $100 to come do it." I'd been cleaning closets for my mom for years at that point. So I thought it was a damn good deal. And it was a huge closet. It's where they put all of their returned phones from canceled customers. There were thousands of phones just thrown in a room that they deemed a closet. But started working at Weave. And then in December of 2016, I actually purchased part of Weave from them. And that really got me into the world of private practice services and being an entrepreneur.
That is an interesting journey from cleaning closets to it's funny how life works that way.
I,
I
I tell people all the time internally, opportunity begets opportunity. And you would never think, I would have never bet or guessed, and I don't think it's very common, to start as a business cleaning closets. I then became like the office manager, where legitimately that was me filling the snacks for the employees. And by the time I left, I was the project manager for the COO and CEO. And so it's just kind of an evolution over time. But I think it shows kind of that American dream at its finest of, okay, you can go in there and you can make reality what you want to. Obviously, I was very fortunate to work with great people who gave me a bunch of opportunities, but I think it's a really cool intro story. The coolest tidbit, though, is the business that they sold us, which was a fragment of Weave at the time, doing about $250,000 a year in revenue. They sold it to us for $1 because they just needed to get rid of it when they were bleeding money. And so that kind of was as 22-year-olds in the business world, it was kind of a no-brainer to not take it over. And we've been stuck in it ever since.
you have major street cred on investing just from that, buying a company for $1 and turning it into. You probably didn't see it at the time, but what came out of $1 is pretty impressive.
Oh yeah. And just really, really lucky in the fact that there were no strings attached and there was no debt on the deal. And they gave us office space, like so fortunate and just a really cool, very unique opportunity.
Yeah. It's funny. Somebody asked me a question once at the end of a podcast that I was being interviewed for. And apparently it was a question that they asked all the guests, and it caught me off guard a little bit. But they said, how much of what you would consider success that you've accomplished is due to luck versus hard work? And it really caused me to stop and think about all the little things that had to happen for me to be where I'm at now in terms of consulting and my opportunities to speak, my opportunities to have a podcast. I could go back and find little things throughout that journey that if I didn't have that conversation with that person, if I wasn't in that place at that moment. And it's really taught me that hard work matters, but you have to put yourself in positions to capitalize on the opportunities that'll come along. And if you try to control, wow, I'm going life coach here, aren't I? But if you try to control too much of it, I think you actually prevent what opportunities might come along organically. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. And I even look at those early days of there was many moments the business should have gone bust where we were one day away from not making payroll. And so, there's just the ebbs and flows of life, and business and life forces you into areas and arenas that you may want or may not want. And you make the most of those opportunities. But yeah, it has an interesting way of being very uncontrolled.
Bringing things back to the present, I referenced a few things before about some challenges that a lot of ODs are facing these days, which I think opens up opportunities for remote staff, for virtual assistants, right in your wheelhouse. But I mentioned staff shortages. I mentioned payroll. These are two real pain points that a lot of optometry practice owners are dealing with. Did I hit it on the head there? Are there others? But what unique challenges do you think optometry practices are facing that virtual assistants can best address?
This is a really good question. So we sat down in December of this last year and kind of roadmapped what's the state of the industry and how do we best help solve things. I look at virtual assistants like a car. And what I mean by that is you don't buy a car for a car most of the time. You buy it for the experiences or the destination. There's three major problems I think facing ODs today. And these are in no particular order, to be very clear. Number one is that they face a enormous amount of missed opportunity. I'll just give one example of that. We sat down with Weave at the beginning of this year and we asked to review all the comm logs from last year for all practices, and they have millions of calls. Over 32% of all phone calls went unanswered. And that's just one example where people have this business funnel and there's just a major gash in the left side of it where they're bleeding opportunity. Or are you doing your recare calls right? Are you diagnosing and following through with the right treatment? Are you following up on your patient billing? So there is meat left on the bone that provides better patient care and drives more revenue for the practice at the same time. So that's number one. Number two, I think you nailed right on the head in our intro that ever since COVID in the United States, there has been a tanking in the reliability and engagement of the US workforce. There was a piece of data that came out from Forbes or Fortune the other day saying 32% of the US workforce is engaged in the work that they're doing. Those are people that are employed. That's scary as a business owner to think 1/3 of your team actually gives a damn. And then third is you've got rising costs. Revolution costs more, Crystal costs more, Weave is costing more, and they're facing costs as a business. But then we take VSP, we take iMed, and those ceilings are not drastically going up at the same time. What does that do to a business owner? Well, if your ceiling's stuck and your floor's moving up, the only person who's getting screwed generally in that equation is the owner because you've still got to pay the bills. You've got to keep the lights on. And so since there's just so many variables of staff and other costs continuing to increase, and then especially with possible tariffs on eyewear, coming up, you're looking at another increase, and it's how do you make the business work so that you can live life outside of work?
What, and you mentioned a few of them already, tasks that virtual assistants can do. Um, can you go over that And maybe I know they can do a lot. I've heard it said that anything that can be outsourced or can be done on a computer could be outsourced. But what are most optometry practices who do utilize VAs using them for? Is it scribing? Is it billing? Is it, all of the above? What and maybe part of that too is what is are they best suited for?
I'll give a framework to answer the broad question, then I'll tell you the most common roles that are 90% of what we staff. If it can be done in a back office, so if you think about your practice, if you had a little closed room and you put staff in there to do any type of responsibility, if it could be done in there, which means it doesn't require great communication with the front desk in a, next to each other manner, and you don't have to see patients face to face, it's very doable. So that's kind of the test of all time. And that means accounting could be done there. Now, when we go to the roles that we're filling 90+% of the time, it's front desk receptionists. It is people to help with insurance verification and revenue cycle management. And it is medical scribes, because those are areas where a lot of meat is left on the bone, or there's a lot of mundane that, if not done right, is just critically detrimental to the practice.
Corey, I did a episode with Dr. Adam Ramsey a while back on virtual assistants, and I asked him how he addressed the issue with the staff because I would think there might be a moment there where they feel threatened by um, VA coming on, that might replace their job. But he approached them and said, "What could I take? Give me," I think he said, "Give me a, a list of things, 4 things that I could take off your plate." And that gave them a different mindset on this, saying, "Oh, okay, these are things that we don't necessarily like to do. It's the administrative stuff." But what it did, it freed up their time to focus on more patient care. So I think a lot of people think of VAs as either replacing a staff or filling a gap, and they could definitely do that. I assume a lot of practices are using these to fill those gaps that they just can't find qualified candidates in their area. But do you find that offices are also using VAs as a way to unload some of the tasks that the current staff is taking on to free up more time to work on more of the high value tasks that need to be done in the office, specifically, probably more patient facing tasks?
100% yes. We are not generally in 90+% of our scenarios. I think there's two main buckets that things are falling in. Number one is, just as you said, they want their staff to be more patient facing. And the front desk is probably wearing 20 individual hats within a given day. And it's really then hard to be fully present with the, patients that are walking in and out. And so I think the goal is to strip some things back, not out of a lack of trust, but of an area of focus. And then the second thing is where I think we're getting brought in is where the practice is struggling to find that reliable talent. They've hired 4 people over the last 16 months, and they're a little bit exasperated or exhausted on continuing to do the same thing and expecting a different outcome. But very rarely are we ever sitting on a call where it's, oh, I'm looking to eliminate someone. It's either they're struggling with that reliability and recruiting portion, or they're attempting to strip things back. One thing that I want to make my stance very clear on is the front desk should never be outsourced. Like, I think about walking into an iPad if I go to my dentist or if I go to my optometrist, I would hate it. But there's certain things that fall on the responsibility of the front desk that I would make the heavy argument shouldn't be there. Let's just take a big like corporate company as an example. You usually have a sales department, you have a customer service department, you have a finance or a billing department. That is all just blended into the typical front desk of an optometry practice. And so if those people can be fully focused on delivering an amazing patient experience, people are going to trust the practice more. People are going to get scheduled at higher rates, and the practice is going to drive a way different and better experience, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. And you use the word experience there multiple times. I am such an advocate for that. What I keep reading and hearing this term, experience economy, that we're in, especially in optometry, where so many things are being commoditized and so many things are, um, you can do now in our industry without having to talk to somebody. I think um, the practices that maintain that high level of service and create a great experience for the patient will really stand out. And think you see the outcomes on the other end of that. I think a lot of times these words just seem kind of fluffy, patient experience, patient journey, those sorts of things. But and the research backs this up. When you do a more effective job at that, the outcomes improve, both in terms of the clinical outcomes for the patient, but the financial um, outcomes for the practice as well.
I think the difference that you get from driving a good experience, and I think you called it out really good. In business, all the time, people use a really fluffy terms. It's all about the experience. What you're really trying to do, in my opinion, in healthcare is to show people you care. People do not want to show up to a doctor feeling like a number, feeling like they're going through a meat processing plant where they're in and out and they just got fumbled through, but that they were not treated as an individual. Your health is one of the most important things that you have out there. And so when someone stops and says, "Hey, Steve, how are your kids? How's your golf game been?" That's what people crave. In a world of automation and AI, which is incredibly important and going to change the game in positive ways, I would make the argument the craving for human connection is only going to become even greater.
Yeah, I would agree completely. Um, how do you handle the training, or how does the practice handle the training? Because this is something that many practices struggle with, even with the people that show up at the practice. So now you've got somebody overseas. What does the process look like? What are the best practices for being able to not just train that person, but also continue to develop them? Something else I'm a huge advocate for is I understand that there's an initial process. Let's call it an onboarding process. Let's say you bring somebody on. Let's say I hired you, Corey, and I bring you out of the automotive industry and you don't know anything about optical. I understand that there's an onboarding process to get you up to at least the basic standards to be able to do your job. Beyond that, I think find it really unfortunate when training stops. So beyond that, I think we'll call it employee development, which I think far too few practices actually do that. All that being said, how do you how do you handle the training process for VAs?
I almost want to bucket this into three separate micro segments because this is a fascinating question. The first thing before I even jump to training, but I think it's important, of something that we look at different, is I feel as a business owner, I've employed thousands of people over my 8 years of doing this, overvalue technical skill unless you are hiring an accountant or something that like technical expertise matters more than anything. But I think about the front desk role in optometry. I feel that people overvalue prior experience and undervalue soft skills and personality fit. And so when we look at the hiring process, before we even jump to training or integration, it's what type of person works well with you, Steve? What type of communicator? Do you want someone who figures it out, or do you want someone who comes back and says, "Hey, Steve, how do we handle this?" And everyone runs their business different. So there's not a one size fits all methodology. You have to individually recruit based on the soft skills and personality that actually work. So that's kind of bucket number one. And that's why I think this idea of having just pre-trained people to make it almost a little crude is like in a typical company, it's like, "Oh, you want to hire, take your pick of the litter." Well, the problem is you're then devaluing the skills that you cannot actually replicate and retrain. So I think you have to start there. Now, when you go into the actual training bucket, I think the important thing that we do and that we want to make easier is everyone uses different pieces of tech. You could have a VoIP system, you could have Weave, you could have Adit, you could have Revolution, you could have Crystal. There's a million different Lego blocks. And so what we have is a learning and development system that the team members can log into, and they can get assigned how to get trained on Crystal, how to get trained on Weave. Okay, they're working in revenue cycle management, how to work with VSP, anything that the practice is using day in and day out. So instead of just blasting them with a typical fire hose and being like, "You're trained in optometry," and they got 30 minutes on each of the main buckets because there's so many different things, we want to provide the Lego set, but then people to individually build their own stack based on the role, and based on the technical softwares that they use. And to be clear, that does not finish the whole block of training. That's almost like a really good foundation, but there is nothing that beats sitting down and saying, here is how we handle cancellations. Here is how we handle new patients. Here is how we reschedule people that call in same day, because every practice does it different. And so we can make the lift easier, but there is nothing that beats one-on-one time and investment. So that's kind of when I look at the training side, the things that I think are important. And then we also have courses for the remote worker and the team and the practice on like how to integrate this person in. It's one thing to have the technical skills in optometry. It's another thing to be like, this is a whole new world. People are like, okay, I know I need to hire remote. And then they start their first day and they look like a deer in the headlights because they haven't done this for 20 or 30 years. And so the goal is actually to give skills on how to do a one-on-one, how to do a performance review, how to bring people into your weekly huddle with your team in a remote environment so that we can make success for this virtual hire who's a real human, just like the rest of us, in the practice who needs the help.
Does TEEM assist with that? I mean, where is the line drawn between what you guys provide and what's expected of the practice? Because you're right. If you've to date, if you've owned a practice for 20 years, there's a very good chance that you've been doing that for 20 years without having to deal with a single remote employee. But like I said, things are changing. Um, where do you guys intervene in terms of helping a practice with some of those things, or is that mostly on the practice?
Where we draw the line, not draw the line, but where we believe we best help is almost playing more of a like guide role or a mentor role where we're here to advise people, but we cannot play the actual role of their boss.
Mhm.
Because as soon as they're reporting to us, we're reporting to an office manager, you're losing that, direct line of communication and integration into the team. And so our goal is to give a lot of tools and skills and be a listening ear, but then equip people to go out there and do it. It's the concept of teach a man to fish or give a man a fish. And we believe, though, it is more difficult to teach to fish. If people can nail it, the remote work's only going to get bigger. And that's not even just an international comment. I think about if I'm in Salt Lake and I own a practice and my biller, who's worked for me for 20 years, moves to Arkansas, I'm going to let him or her work remote because they know me. And so, again, you have to master that new form of communication.
So for that patient, or not patient, but for that employee that moves from Salt Lake City to Arkansas, let's talk about something that I think causes a lot of doctors who haven't done this before a little bit of unease on this topic, and that would be trust. I think since this became sort of a thing within optometry, I think practices that haven't done it yet, or maybe a little bit skeptical, they hesitate due to trust. How do I know you're doing the work if you're not here? Again, the practice that's been there for 20 years has probably been operating under the premise that for that 20 years, somebody's been there, either the doctor, a manager, somebody to oversee that people are actually doing the work. And I think it's a fair concern. Um, that being said, and when I look at these changing demographics and a younger generation coming up, almost expecting, right, to be able to do more work remotely, is remote more suited to project-driven work as opposed to punching a clock? In other words, here's tasks or projects that I need completed today or this week versus trying to police how they're getting it done.
I think it's a really good question on trust. And as a business owner, let's just be very candid. It is hard to trust. And we've worked in a private practice environment where you get a trust with your eyes. But I think the best thing that we can start doing as a business owner, having had my own evolution through the years, is trust actually comes from setting great expectations and then bringing it back at the time those expectations should be met. And so it means that you shouldn't have to be there every second to have trust because you've set clear vision and deliverables and expectations that you believe when everyone plays their individual roles really well, the practice works as a well-oiled machine. So let's just go, before we even hop into what do we do at TEEM, let's talk about our biller in Arkansas. It's setting, this is what I want monthly collections to look like. Here is how quickly I want claims submitted. And then you can go in once every 2 weeks, once every month, and not only say I trust, but I verify, and that we're delivering those expectations and goals. And the best thing that we can do is, instead of saying we want to be busy, it's that we want to deliver value. Patients come back because they get great value. Employees come back because they get great value. And so the more that we can drive it to results instead of action, I actually think delivers better outcomes, and it removes the stress of having to hover. Now, you called it perfectly, that moving from I've seen it for 20 years, I've seen it for 10 years, to I'm not seeing it, but I'm just seeing maybe some results here and there, is hard. And so we provide a portal that people are able to log into, where they can see the number of text messages handled, the number of phone calls handled, the number of new patients scheduled, the number of appointments that have been scribed in the day. Because again, if you came to me and said, hey, they're good, but I'm just not sure if it's the right fit, instead of saying, well, they say they're working really hard, and you, Steve, saying, well, I'm not sure if this is good, we can look at the data, and then we can look at the expectations around what the practice needs and wants then, but the expectations that were set before we started, and we can make a very numbers-based and numbers-driven decision. And so people then daily can log in and see the value and results that their team members bringing. And then it never becomes a he said or she said moment on any side, because it's a data-driven decision around expectations.
Yeah, I like the focus on results as well, because I think what we find, and this is not unique to optometry, but a workforce, a staff that's very busy, they're in motion, but not getting the results that they want. And that's really what matters. And, hearing you talk about this really highlights some of the leadership aspects of this, that remote workers almost force you to lean into some of the leadership aspects that you maybe have neglected for the in-office staff. And I jotted down a few of them: setting clear expectations. You have to. They're not there. They need to be very clear on what they need to do. You have no choice. Developing them, right? The training, the development. Again, you're not there watching them, overseeing them all the time to give them that direct feedback on the spot. So you've got to make sure that you're putting in the work on the front end so they know how to do their job and they know how to do it effectively when they're not around. Accountability as well, being able to accountability is just a mechanism putting people in a place in which they know they're going to have to answer for their performance at a later date, right? And I think, again, a lot of times that's something that's neglected internally with an internal staff, but there's got to be some kind of mechanism set up where a remote employee is going to have to report back on outcomes. So there's a lot of great things that actually come out of that might sort of force you into a position of sharpening your own leadership skills.
And I think there's I agree that remote forces you, instead of saying, okay, I can see what's happening, it forces you to build systems and
Mm-hmm.
processes. I grew up in a place a little south of where I live right now in Holiday, Utah. And there's an amazing Greek food place near my parents' house. And I would go there all the time. He's still open today. Whenever he's open, the place is bustling. But what's interesting, Bob, who is the owner, is only open when Bob is in the building, when Bob's on vacation, when Bob is sick. Greek City Grill is closed. And what it shows is that when you can set great systems and processes as a leader, it allows you to live life outside of work. And I look at Bob, and when you're there, he makes some of the best food out there, but it's been unable so far, because of a lack of trust or systems, to be scalable. And because of that, Bob is probably more stressed because the business rides on his backbone. And so this is not only about developing you and your team further, but allowing you to take that step back. Let's just be super candid here. Like, we all love what we do for the most part, but we work so that we can enjoy experiences with the people that we love. And if you can't take that step back from work as a business owner, you're just constantly stuck in the grinder. And so this is not only just about remote work and better systems and development, but it's allowing you to live the life, if properly done, that we all want to live.
being that it is remote, what are most practices finding the best ways to communicate? Because there's no water cooler. We can stand around and chat. There's no, hey, swing by my office before you leave today, because there's something I want to talk to you about. So are more practices finding ease of communication through things like Zoom, email, text, smoke signals? What is the preferred, or is it just all of the above?
There's three buckets that I think are vital to good communication. Instead of just saying we want to be good communicators, I actually think it breaks into three technical areas. Number one, they have to be integrated into your team. And that means if you have a morning or a weekly huddle where you say, this person is out, we're no longer accepting this insurance, or we are, going to be expanding to a second building. If you are not communicating the large scale nuances with them, they have to be integrated and a part of your team. Number two, you have to then have some type of weekly or monthly one-on-one with them where you can provide feedback that is attuned to them and get their feedback on what's working and what's not. If you're just joining a weekly huddle, they're not going to raise their hand and say, I'm really struggling, or I'm not sure I understand how to do this. And so generally, I think they need to join any staff meeting that takes place. And then at a minimum, have a monthly one-on-one where you can bring feedback and say, hey, I listened to some calls in preparation for this meeting. Here's what you can do better. Use your hammer as a leader to build them to be greater and not to break them, and to get more aligned. And then the third is that micro or daily communication. I know Weave is a large presence in optometry, and they have an in-office chat tool. And we have hundreds of practices on Weave, and there's many other tools just like Slack, Microsoft Teams, where you can say, hey, I've got someone coming in, or someone interested in coming in at 4 today. It's truly an emergency. Can we make it work? Or is Corey's frames here? And that communication can help you in those nuanced moments. And I think those three combined together drives really good communication and alignment with your virtual team member.
Yeah, I think you answered my next question, which you focused on when you talked about integrating with the current office flow. About 10 years ago, I was, we were talking before about opportunities. About 10 years ago, I was given an opportunity to move from Chicagoland area to Atlanta to take this consulting job, which was a complete leap of faith. I never did anything like this before. I was surprised I even got the job. And it was, I found out in that moment all these other people that I had known in my life that moved or relocated or got transferred. It's a lot harder when it's you and you're putting your house up for sale and moving the kids and taking them out of their school and moving away from family. And I was having a real hard time with it. I remember friends and family um, saying, can't you do this remote? This 10 years ago, pre-COVID, like this wasn't as big of a thing as it is now. But I remember thinking it's possible I could ask about that, but I felt like I needed to be in the office, part of the team, visible. So that's where I was going to go with the next question was how do you make people that are working remote feel like they're part of the team? And I think you answered that with how you led that with talking about how you integrate them with the daily flow. If you have a daily huddle, make them part of it, right? If you have team events, bring them into that so that I think it's very important that they feel like they're very much part of that work family.
So we predominantly hire out of Latin America. And when we got started in the podcast today, you talked about how outsourcing or hiring internationally, we've heard of Apple and T-Mobile and Wells Fargo doing it for a long time. It's only been new to optometry. And I think only in recent years has there even been the technology to even do it. But since most of these people that we hire have worked for massive corporations like Deloitte or Accenture prior, they crave to be a part of a smaller, more impactful team. My greatest piece of advice on how to integrate someone in beyond the communication is treat them as yours. I think the traditional bones of outsourcing are broken, where you upload some documents on your computer and you come back in the next day and they're done, but they're done at an 80% quality because there's not great communication. They don't understand you and your practice. And so if you invest in bringing people under, your hood to really get them a part of your team. It's why we call the business team, because we think the model of outsourcing in the old school way does not lead to good quality. This is about getting cost effectiveness, but the equal quality that you get from an in-person team member.
And I'm going to go back to the episode I did with Dr. Adam Ramsey. He mentioned, I believe, that I think at the time, he might have hired more since then, but he had one virtual assistant. And I believe he said at the end of every day, she provides a report of what she did, what she accomplished that day, which brings us back to, I think something that is more applicable to remote work is outcomes. What did you do? Because you're not there. Did you clock in at 9 and did you clock out for lunch and are you working every minute? It's just different on the remote aspect. So I think it's really important that you give them clear expectation on what they're supposed to do. But it brings us to the question too, is how do you know if they're succeeding? Like, how do you know if they're getting the job done? I think he said in his case he has them provide a daily report at the end of the day. Um, on what they accomplished that day, how close they got to their goals or tasks. But is that something that you see as a best practice with remote workers, or do you have other ideas, or have you seen other things work to make sure that we're have some kind of mechanism in place to make sure that the employee is actually accomplishing the work that we need them to do?
When I started owning my own business years ago, one of my favorite questions that stuck with me is someone was interviewing and they said, "What does success in this role look like?" And you say it and you give a conceptual, comment. And then they said, "Quantify that. Like, what does success actually look like? If I'm a salesperson, do I need to sell 10 cars a month? Is it 15 cars a month?" It's not just, oh, you're going to come in and sell a lot of cars. Before you make any hire, you need to ask yourself, what does success for me in this practice look like in this role? And then quantify it. And then you have really clear deliverables and expectations. So, not at the end of the day, I'm just saying, "Hey, Steve, I answered 12 calls today." It's, I know what the expectation and deliverable is, and then I'm able to draw my daily outputs back to that and saying, I'm succeeding or I'm not.
What does this space look like in 5 years, in 10 years? Because as we were talking before, there's a lot of interest and more practices utilizing virtual assistants. And I want to be clear too that this was not a lot of the things we're talking about apply to that office manager or that biller that you've got on site that asks a question they probably never would have asked 5 years ago, 10 years ago, is can I work from home? And offices now are saying, yeah, let's at least they're open to that idea. So I think a lot of things we're talking about apply to that as well. But what do you foresee if as we close out here, looking into your crystal ball and you're seeing the trends, you're seeing the growth, and maybe this is you know, helpful to offices that haven't yet made that leap and looking at the trends in the future that they should be paying attention to. What do you think the future looks like in terms of remote talent?
I'm going to answer it in almost a more unique way, because I think there is a large movement of remote talent and optometry, and I think that will continue. Something that I think is the rumblings are beginning of, we're just not seeing the movement yet, but the earthquake is coming, is artificial intelligence. And that's going to be medical scribing appointments being way more efficient in the future, or someone being able, or you having an AI agent being able to pick up a new patient phone call, or to have a AI agent call an insurance company to go through a authorization or an eligibility check. And so I think there's kind of two things. And in other private practice industries that we operate in, we are seeing AI a lot more relevant today. What that means is we know it's coming. We just don't know exactly when, but I would expect within the next 18 to 24 months, we start to see some viable use forms in optometry. What I think and how I think those two play well together is I look at AI as a sewing machine or as steroids, where it can take your team, whether they're virtual or in person, and make them way more effective. What I don't think is going to go away is people's craving and desire for human touch and human empathy. And so I think practices over the next 5 years are going to be radically more effective and pulled out of the mundane and have those remote engaged workers paired with AI that's going to 2 or 3, X your output to allow them to be really focused in on the people who need that human touch.
I think it's a great place to end, and I agree completely. I was actually talking with somebody who's involved with IT, and he said he's been working with his team less on the technical side, anticipating that AI is going to level the playing field on a lot of things. And I think this is the same with doctors too, right? You could have advanced clinical knowledge and clinical skills. I mean, all of us that got through optometry school, some of us are a little smarter than others, right? AI is going to level the playing field on a lot of things. Um, so in his case, working in the IT space, he said, I'm actually spending less time on the technical aspects. I'm focusing more on how they better communicate and engage with our clients. He says that's going to be the differentiator in the future, not how good of a coder you are, because that's all going to be pretty much leveled out at some point. He says where you're going to differentiate yourself is how effectively are we engaging, interacting, and back to where we started, what kind of experience are we creating for the client?
Amen to that. I was thinking just as you were closing there about, the full circle experience comment. And so I 100% agree. And I think that will be the king of differentiation going forward.
Corey, it's been a pleasure as always. Where can people find you, team, find out more about you, utilize team? Where do they have to go? What do they have to look up?
Yeah. So people can go to our website, which is www.hireteam, HIRETEEM.com. And then if people would ever love to connect, professionally, you can add me on LinkedIn or you can email me. And my email is just Corey, CORY at hireteam.com. But it's been an absolute pleasure today, Steve.
Thanks, Corey. This was great, very helpful, topical, and yeah, I know people got a ton out of this. So thanks again. Thank you to Corey, and thanks everyone for listening. If you'd like more information about iDoc and how we work with ODs to help grow their practice, you can find out more at our website, idoc.net. So thanks again. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.